The crisis in Gaza continues unabated. Friday saw a proposed 72-hour ceasefire broken within a matter of just hours. My next guest is Miko Peled. He's an Israeli peace activist. Miko, thanks for joining me. How, first of all, did you become a peace activist?
Well, activist, I don't know if peace activist is a word, especially under the circumstances. I don't think peace is perhaps no longer the appropriate term, but certainly activist, a pro-Palestinian activist. Well, it's a rather long story, which is why I have a book. That's why I wrote The General Son, because it's a rather long story. But the short reply would be that as these things are, it's always a gradual process. But I think, if we want to pinpoint it, the strongest thing that drove me was when I began meeting with Palestinians and kind of opened myself up to the possibility that the narrative upon which I grew up is not true, and that the Palestinian narrative has merit. And then from there to realizing that out of the two narratives, only one could be true because they are diametrically opposed, because the differences between them are not small. They're not differences in detail. The differences, they're diametrically opposed. They're great differences, and only one can be true. And the more I looked into it, the more I read, and the more I spoke to people, and the more I traveled in Palestine, I realized that I actually grew up in Palestine, although I didn't know it. I thought it was all called Israel. I grew up with people that I never met, an entire civilization, an entire nation that were my neighbors and I never met, and these were the Palestinians. And that's why the book is, the General Son, and then also the journey of an Israeli in Palestine, because the journey is what led me to understand what Palestine is all about and the depth of the narrative of the Palestinian people.
You've got personal experience of this because I understand your niece was killed in a terrorist attack. And yet, from what I understand, that has actually, in a way, brought you and your close family, particularly your sister, the child's mother, very much more into focus about the issues that are underlying this whole situation.
Yes, well, that was certainly a moment that shook all of us. There's no question about that. I was born into the situation. My family's been involved in the establishment of the State of Israel and the military for, since the very beginning. My grandfather was one of the signers of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. My father was a general during the 1967 war. I was raised very deeply in this, not so much as an observer, but as somebody whose entire family is involved in the process. And then in 1997, when Smadar was killed, my sister's daughter was killed, my sister Nurit stood up and very courageously spoke about the fact that if we're looking for blame, if we're looking for who's responsible, then we need to look at the cause of the conflict. We need to look at who it is that's causing the oppression, who is that's responsible for the oppression against the Palestinians, who is it that is responsible for the occupation of Palestine. Who is it that's killing Palestinians indiscriminately? Who is it that's denying Palestinian water and rights and incarcerating thousands and thousands of Palestinians? This is who's responsible for the violence. That is why there is violence. And she very clearly said the Israeli government is responsible for my daughter's death. So that was that shook everybody, including me, when she said these things. And it drove me into this journey of discovery about Palestine and about the Palestinians, and discovering and realizing what I consequently realized.
Your answer seems to be that the whole area should not be a two-state solution, but a one-state solution with equal rights for all its citizens. Given that you've just said that there can only be one of two truths, how on earth could that work?
Well, Israel created a reality where there is one state over all of Palestine. There is no room for another state in Palestine. Israel created a reality where the entire country is one state. It's all governed by the state of Israel. The populations are completely mixed, even though they're completely segregated. They are mixed, and even though it's an apartheid state where only one side has rights, the Israelis have rights and the Palestinians do not, it still functions as one state. The life of every Palestinian and the life of every Israeli is governed by the state of Israel. So the question of partition is no longer relevant because there is no area where you could say, okay, well, this will be Palestine because it's predominantly Palestinian. There's no such area anymore. There is no more West Bank. The two-state solution was based on the idea that the West Bank would be a Palestinian state. Well, there is no more West Bank. It's only in the minds of people who are old enough to remember that there was a West Bank, that there is a West Bank. There is no more West Bank. And so, since Israel created a reality where there's one state over the entire country and the population is completely mixed and there is no way to divide the population, not that it would have been a good idea anyway, but there is no possibility for it anymore. The only other solution, if we agree that we reject racism, if we agree that we reject apartheid, if we agree that we reject the brutal violence of this colonialist, racist regime, which is what Israel is, then a democracy with equal rights for everyone is the only other solution. It's a small country. Like I said, the population is, even though it's segregated and unequal, it is mixed. And so the only other way to do this is to replace this racist regime, racist colonialist apartheid regime, with a normal democracy, which is what was done in South Africa and in other places.
Do you think it could work in Israel? Because it does seem as well that a high proportion of the population of Israel, although we have seen demonstrations on the streets about what's going on in Gaza at the moment, the majority do seem to be behind their government, and everywhere you look on social media, all you see very often is people saying, well, what would you do if they fired rockets at you?
Yeah, these things don't happen because the privileged agree. These things happen because the privileged one day realize that it's over. Apartheid didn't fall because the whites decided to give up their privilege in South Africa. Apartheid in South Africa fell because the whites in South Africa realized they can no longer function like this and they have no choice. And there's no doubt in my mind that Israelis are going to be facing the very same reality, and very soon. Not because they want to, not because no privileged group ever wants to or is willing to give up their privileges, but because it is no longer sustainable. Besides the fact that it's morally wrong and unjust, it is not sustainable. There is already a majority of Palestinians living there. Out of 12 million people, 6.1 million today are Palestinians. We know that in Gaza alone, there are going to be another 500,000 people in the next 5-6 years. The reality that Israel created in Gaza is, besides being criminal, is not sustainable. You can't have 2 million people living without water, without proper medicine, without proper nutrition, without the ability to travel or trade or live as normal people do. And mind you, this is a 5-minute, like 2 miles away from modern Israeli cities where life is completely normal, where everybody has electricity and as much water and as much medicine as they want, where life is, like a modern functioning state.
The bottom line, though, Miko, I'm being devil's advocate here, is that you have surely to get Hamas to stop firing the rockets. I think thinking people understand exactly why they're firing the rockets, because, as you say, they're living in conditions that we've seen so many people say, I'm either going to die slowly or I might as well go quickly. I mean, they seem to be completely without hope. You do have to persuade, don't you, if you're going to have two people who have so much hatred between them living together, you have to have some way of bringing them together. Do you think that Hamas would play along with your scenario and stop any form of, if you like, retaliation?
Hamas is a resistance organization. The only reason Hamas exists is because of the oppression and the brutality of the Israeli occupation in Palestine. Resistance organizations are created in response to oppression. They don't come out just out of nowhere. Hamas is a resistance organization, and everything they do, both politically and, if you want to call it militarily, although it's not really military, is in response to the oppression. It's a resistance organization, and it's sanctioned by international law, and it's sanctioned by United Nations resolutions. People have a right to fight for their freedom and for their independence. So, as soon as there's a breakdown, as I truly believe there will be, and sooner than what most people think, of the Zionist regime, The two sides will inevitably have to go to the polls and have free and fair elections that include everybody, Israelis and Palestinians. And then we move on from there. The only, like I said, resistance ends as soon as the oppression ends.
You've got a lot of friends who are Palestinians, and I'm sure much better insight into things on the ground in Gaza than almost anybody else. What do they say about their hopes for the future?
Well, it's very interesting when you talk to the difference between what you hear when you talk to Israelis and what you hear when you talk to Palestinians is very interesting. When you talk to Palestinians, the conversation is almost always how can we get along? How can we get beyond the violence? How can we get beyond the conflict? I visited the home of Nadim Nawara, who was a young man who was murdered by Israeli forces at a protest near Ofer prison in May. And I sat there with a family and so forth, and near Ramallah, and that was a conversation. Conversation is not all Jews are our enemy, not all Israelis are the problem. The problem is that we have this injustice and we need our freedom, and then we can live as normal people. The conversation in Israel, whether you're in a taxi, whether you're in the street, whether you're listening to the news, whether you're listening to politicians, regardless of where you are, is always about how more can we kill, how many more Palestinians can we kill, how can we crush them harder, how can we destroy Gaza more. The difference between the two sides is striking in terms of the conversation, in terms of the debate. Israel is a very racist, very violent society.
Yes, so the question remains, how on earth do you bring them on board into a shared state?
You create a reality where they have no choice.
And the reality, Miko, is that everybody is being fed such massive disinformation. And in fairness, it is happening to some degree on both sides, but there is undoubtedly, what do you call it, Hasbara, I think, in Israel, where information is so greatly censored and doctored that is it surprising they don't have any idea of what's going on?
No, it's not. I mean, this is the reality in all racist societies. South Africa was the same. The whites in South Africa were sure that the blacks were going to murder them and rape their women. As soon as, apartheid, as soon as they had lost control, that would be the end of all life for white people. And we know that most white people remained, and the sky didn't fall, and they had Nelson Mandela as president. So even though in the late 80s people still didn't think it was going to happen, by 1994 Mandela was president. So these things have a life of their own, and I think there's an inevitability in the transformation, particularly in such a small country with two populations that are highly educated and highly professional. I mean, even in Gaza, literacy rates are some of the highest in the world, over 92% literacy rate, and even under such harsh conditions, people go to school, and they've got, I think, 8 universities in Gaza. So we're not talking about a situation where you've got millions of uneducated, impoverished people. You've got two societies that are highly educated, that can know how to function. Even Hamas in Gaza functions quite well by all measures as a state, even with all the difficulty. And so they know how to run. Both sides know how to govern. Both sides have traditions of democracy, albeit imperfect. And there's no reason why it cannot work. Now, these things don't happen because people want them to happen. There's a reality here. I'm sure Palestinians in Gaza would rather wake up one morning and see that all the Israelis disappeared. Of course, that's not likely to happen. And it's not likely to happen that the Palestinians are going to disappear either. And so this is a reality that both sides need to come to terms with. I argue that Palestinians have come to terms with it. Their willingness to live together, as long as we live with equality and justice. They've been ready to do this for a very long time. Israelis are going to have to get used to it, and they will get used to it the day after it happens. And that's what happens with privileged societies.
What is your hope for the whole area? And, I mean, a timeline is almost impossible to fathom, particularly bearing in mind the hopes that we had for something to come out of Cairo meetings and then the break in that ceasefire.
I don't know that I had any hopes of the Cairo meetings. The Egyptian regime is a rogue regime that is collaborating with Israel and the U.S., and their proposals for a ceasefire, I think, were unacceptable by any measure, by any standard. So I don't think there was any hope, because what the Egyptians and the Americans and the Israelis are trying to do is bring the Palestinians to surrender. And they won't surrender. They won't surrender. And any ceasefire that does not include rebuilding, the end of the siege, and release of prisoners does not make any sense. So in that regard, I think the Palestinians are on the right track, although tragically they're paying a heavy price. But I do believe that once these things do happen, and inevitably they will happen, eventually, I think when the body count reaches 2, 3, 4,000 in Gaza, the world will begin to notice, and somebody will step in and force Israel to stop and lift the siege, eventually pay for the damages and repatriate the refugees, and then move on until eventually the Zionist regime collapses and we have a real democracy. And then, if you take away this regime, this horrific racist regime, then what we see is a country full of potential, and I think they will meet that potential.
I have to just run this past you. I spoke last week on the programme to Paul Hershen, a spokesman from the Israeli Foreign Ministry, who, regardless of what I asked him, was most insistent in saying that there was only a naval blockade in Gaza, that there was no occupation. What do you say to that?
Well, he's a liar. He works for a racist, oppressive, brutal regime. Obviously, he's going to lie. And Israelis believe, like the Nazis did, that the more you repeat the lie, the more people believe it. And I think they've succeeded. People are believing their lies. I don't know why people are giving a platform for Israelis and the Israeli point of view to be aired. I think they should be shunned. They lie, they kill, they murder indiscriminately, and of course then they try to make it seem as though the victim is to blame. Israel has locked Gaza. Gaza is a concentration camp. People are dying because of lack of basic medicines, where, like I said, a mile, 2 miles away from there, you have modern Israeli cities that lack nothing. And the only reason the people in Gaza are dying is because they are Palestinians. It has nothing to do with Hamas. It has nothing to do with rockets. The blockade, actually, and the killing and the attacks on Gaza didn't begin with Hamas. They began in the early 1950s when the Gaza Strip was created and the refugee problem was created as a result of the ethnic cleansing that Israel conducted in Palestine. We cannot take this, what is happening today, we cannot separate it and isolate it from the rest of what Israel has been doing for the last 65 years. This is why there's a problem. And the only solution will come when this racist, insane, violent regime falls and is replaced with a real democracy.